Part 34. "Oh, a treasure hunt!" Margaret cried out, looking excited. Elisa nodded and scurried over to the side of one of the couches. She pulled out 3 pink bags with the fuzzy handles. I groaned. Then she produced 3 lists. "We will break up into 3 teams," she explained, as if she were talking to small children. "I can't play because, well, I made up the game," she chuckled. "But I'll be here for the first team, and I'll be checking your bags against the list. Oh, and no getting help from anyone outside of your team. And the first one back, with the most things on their list, wins," she ended, throwing her arms out, looking like a very strange store display. "I'll take Missy," I stated, glancing at Allison and Paige, who nodded, letting me know they understood. Elisa frowned. "I wanted you to pair with somebody you don't already know." She poked out her lower lip a little, and I shook my head. "Sorry, Missy is my partner," I finished, not going to embarrass her by telling them I had to watch out for her. "Reina, please, dear, this is so we can all get to know each other better. I know one team will have to know each other, but since this is your party, I had hoped you would pair with one of my dearest friends." Missy smiled at me. "It's okay. What could go wrong here in the manor?" Famous last words, I thought. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" I let myself think. Then I bit my lower lip. I wouldn't know whether he could or not, because I can't hear him. That was just not fair. "Well, if you can hear me, Elisa wants to do a treasure hunt, but she wants to split us up into teams with people we don't know. I'm supposed to watch out for Missy. The guys will kill me if something happens. If you think this is a bad idea, can you burn something now?" I shrugged, hoping he could hear me, and that the fire alarm would blast any second. Yes, vampires had fire alarms and sprinkler systems. We may be nearly just indestructible, but our homes and belongings were not. "Well then," Elisa smiled, looking at us. "Nicole, why don't you go with Reina?" she chirped, although it sounded a little rehearsed if you ask me. Nicole smiled and walked over, taking the bag and list from Elisa and smiling at me. "This'll be fun," she grinned, and I nodded slowly. Missy was put with Margaret, and I let Jonathan know that as well. Paige and Allison made up the last team. "Since they don't really know each other that well," Elisa explained. Well, I felt better for the 2 of them. I didn't care too much about me, but I was worried about Missy. "Now, we all walk out the door, then you can look at your lists, and off you go." "Is there a time limit?" I asked. "You can't want us just wandering around until we find everything on the list." "Oh, right, let's see. 1 hour ought to do it." "An hour?" I gasped. How long did she expect this party to go? I had thought it would only be a few hours total. "Okay, let's try 30 minutes. She looked at me, and I finally nodded. I hadn't heard the fire alarm yet, so I assumed either Jonathan couldn't hear me, or I was making a much bigger deal out of this than I needed to. But when we walked out of the door, Jonathan and Joel were standing with Michael and Martin. I smiled at Jonathan, and he gave me a quick wink. "Ah, perfect timing. The party is over, Joel. Now we can take the girls and—" "Over? Of course not," Elisa laughed. "We're just getting started." "A treasure hunt," Nicole stated, eyeing Jonathan more than I liked. "Really?" he said, and Elisa nodded. "Yes, but they're not allowed to get any help." She winked at him and went to turn. "Well, I suppose," he glanced at Joel, "as long as it doesn't take too long. He and I had plans with them, too." Elisa frowned. I didn't realize there was a time limit. I had thought we would stay up all night." She pouted, and I think she actually stamped her foot a bit. Jonathan's brows rose. Did you clear that with her dad and Phil? Her eyes widened. Well, no, but I didn't think. It's right here in the manor, and she chuckled down. We are old enough to stay up all night. Jonathan and Michael's watches beeped at the same time. They both looked at me. Missy quickly asked to use the bathroom, and Elisa chuckled about how amazing all the things she was learning about werewolves were. I heard her telling her friends about the kitchen and the full bathrooms as I took Missy's hand, and we followed Michael and Jonathan down the hallway. Michael pulled the thermos out of his coat. What else did he keep in there? Jonathan checked the readout and then handed it to me. I gulped it down. A treasure hunt, he chuckled, and I eyed him hard. Yes, was all I could say. What are you supposed to find? I don't know, I huffed. Nicole has the list and the pink frilly bag. Jonathan shook his head. Boy, she is evil, isn't she? Missy chuckled. If she were in Polson, she would never. Jonathan shook a big brother finger at her. Now you two have to stay out of trouble. It took a lot of work to get the pack to let Missy stay here without Miles and the others. I nodded. Fine, we'll be good. He eyed me longer and I shrugged. What? I already promised Track I wouldn't eat anyone. Michael chuckled and I smiled up at him. Jonathan, however, wasn't smiling. Joel and I'll work something out. Suffer a little longer and we'll see what we can do. I looked at Missy, who shrugged. Maybe after the party you can come back and we can have some actual fun, I smiled. Jonathan nodded. But not if you two get into trouble. They won't let her back without a full pack, if then. Information understood, Captain. I smiled and gave him a salute. He chuckled and shook his head. I know, I stated. What are you gonna do with me? We walked back to the others, and Nicole and Margaret were looking at Missy with much more interest now. Great. Nicole took my arm. Okay, let's go, she smiled and started to pull me down the hallway. Remember, 30 minutes, Elisa called after us, and then I heard her voice change into the T-top. So, Jonathan, Joel, what do you have planned for them that is making me cut my party short? Nicole pulled me down the stairs, then she lifted the list. Okay, first thing on it is a bikini. A bikini? I asked, glancing over at the list. So we headed off towards the pool room. I had to assume we all had different things on our list, because the others didn't follow us. Nicole looked back at Michael and then whispered, Does he really have to come with us? I nodded. Yep. He's attached to me by an invisible string, I chuckled, and she turned and looked. We got the bathing suit out of the changing room. Next is a screwdriver. I wrinkled my nose, but she looked at me. I shrugged. I guess either the maintenance room or maybe the garage? I looked at Michael, but Nicole shook her head. We can't get any help, remember? I saw Missy and Margaret walking down the hall the other way, and I smiled to see Martin following them. Jonathan must have arranged that, and I felt a little better. The garage was closer, so we headed there. There were 2 guys working under the hood of one of the cars. They smiled at us, and I went to ask them, but Nicole shook her head. So we walked over to a large work area and rummaged through the drawers. Here's one, she announced and held it up, then dropped it in the bag. Isn't this fun? Elisa is so great at putting together parties, she exclaimed. I didn't have to answer because she smiled at me. So, are you nervous? About? The party, and about being an official couple with someone like Jonathan Hilver, she whispered. I shrugged. Yeah, I guess. A little. She nodded. I would be terrified. Then looked around the massive garage. But then again, you're used to living the life of higher vampires, so I'm sure it'll be nothing for you. She hugged my arm and then lifted the list. Now just what did that mean? What would be so different? Okay, well, living outside of the manor was a little scary to think about, but it wasn't like I had never left here. Okay, the next thing is a hairbrush. I nodded, still thinking about what she said as we made our way back into the manor. What was the life of higher vampires supposed to mean? I had sat in on a few council meetings with my dad. They were beyond boring, but nothing scary. Did she mean that Jonathan's life was so different that I might have a hard time adjusting? I bit my lower lip and barely heard her as she rambled on about what she was going to wear to the party and how glad she was to get a last-minute invitation. We walked into my room and I skulked over to my dresser, picking up a brush. She took it and dropped it in the bag. "So, what does his apartment look like?" she whispered, smiling. "Is it completely classy or a bachelor mess?" Her eyes were wide with anticipation, and I frowned. "Well, I don't know. I haven't seen it." She stood up straight. The smile faded. "Oh, um, She pulled up the list quickly. "Let's see, the next thing is a cup." She looked at me. "A cup?" I nodded. "In the kitchen." Her eyes sparkled. "Oh, the kitchen. I can't wait to see it. We don't have one at our house. But then again, we don't have many non-vampires over," she shrugged as we walked. "My dad says I have to be careful about that, but I don't agree. I've met a few werewolves, briefly, and they were great. Then your friend Missy, well, she is lovely." I rolled my eyes and walked, still trying to decipher what she meant about my life with Jonathan. We got the cup and she dropped it in the bag. Then we found a set of keys, a pen, and a roll of tape. That one took a while. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. We looked up at him and he told us the 30 minutes was up. "Finally!" I wanted to scream as we headed back towards the sitting room. Nicole skipped along, chatting away about random things. When we walked in, the others were there, and only Paige and Allison looked like they might have had a good time. I watched Missy, but her head was down. I looked at Margaret, and she smiled at me. Elisa walked over and took our bag. Then she bounced over to a table and told us all to sit while she looked them over. I walked over to Missy. "Everything okay?" I whispered. She nodded. "Yeah, but she was getting on my nerves." I had to agree there. Elisa turned around and smiled. "Well, Reina and Nicole won. They had the most from their list," she announced. "Of course. You should have seen the stuff on our list," Missy chuckled too quietly for the others to hear. "Something called a Rolodex?" I looked at her and she shrugged. "This is all a setup," I hissed, and she nodded. Elisa brought us our gift bags, and Nicole gasped as she pulled out her pretty little purse. She looked at the label on it and acted as if she was going to faint. I looked at mine and shrugged. I had no idea who the maker was. I smiled. "It's beautiful," I managed, which was true, and somehow mine just happened to match my party dress nearly perfectly. "Now for some fun," Elisa stated as she had us all sit on the floor. "Let's play Truth or Dare." Her minions giggled and nodded. I looked at Paige and Allison, who were frowning. "Jonathan, we need a fire now," I let my mind call out. Elisa grinned. "I'm the hostess, so I will go first." She looked around at all of us and then turned to Allison. "Allison, truth or dare?" Allison's eyes widened, and then I tilted my head. The shields over the windows were lifted, and I saw something outside. I leaned forward, peering over Elisa. "What the heck?" I whispered and stood. Everyone turned, and Allison stood up. "Is that smoke?" she asked, then looked at me with a small smile on her face. Missy met us at the window. The tinted glass was still dark, but the shield was up so we could see down into one of the gardens in the back. The gray smoke drifted up and we looked down. Is that a fire? Missy asked, and the others joined us, all looking out of the enormous picture window. It looks like a bonfire, Nicole exclaimed. There's Jonathan and that other boy, she stated, tapping the window to point. Sure enough, Jonathan and Joel were sitting in chairs around what looked like a small bonfire. I squinted, letting my wolf and vampire eyes adjust. They had a large barrel of some kind set in a circle covered in dirt, the flames dancing out of it. Then I saw Miles, and I glanced over at Missy. She smiled at me, and I grinned back. I leaned on the windowsill. I think they're having their own party. Ooh, who is that? Margaret gasped, with her forehead almost plastered to the window. That's Missy's mate, Miles, Paige stated quickly. Hey, there's Marcus and Phil, I exclaimed. I looked around but didn't see Track, Rock, or Jackson. Then I remembered they were on party errands. The guys were setting up more chairs around the fire and laughing and talking. I bit my lower lip. Can we go out there? Nicole cried out, her eyes still glued on the scene below. I stepped back. But what about the party? I said, turning and looking around the very pink room. Nicole looked at Elisa, the plea in her eyes. Oh, please, Elisa, there are boys down there. Elisa was watching out the window too, but I shook my head. We really shouldn't. Elisa went to so much trouble, and this was supposed to be females only, wasn't it? Missy nodded, biting back her grin. I walked back towards the room. I'm not so much for truth or dare, but I'm sure Elisa has other games for us to do. I looked at Elisa, who turned reluctantly from the window. Allison, Paige, and Missy stepped up to me, catching on quickly. We had to make this Elisa's idea, or things would just get worse. Margaret and Nicole were pleading with their eyes as they looked at her friend. Elisa stole another glance down at the guys, and then looked at me. Well, it's Reina's party, if she wants to go down there. Her friends turned to me with the same hope on their faces. I shrugged. It's just Jonathan, Joel, and some of my pack brothers. We can hang with them any time. Elisa went to a lot of work, I stated. Their faces dropped, and then the smoke thickened as more fuel was added. Elisa looked back out the window. Oh, let's go, she smiled and turned to me. It'll be fun. Before I could comment, Elisa and her friends were headed for the door. I smiled at my friends, and we all moved into the hallway, and I led the way to the door that would open nearest where the guys were. When we got closer to it, Michael cleared his throat. I turned, and he shook his head at me. I frowned and mouthed, "What?" When he didn't reply, I pointed to the door, and everyone went outside. I looked at Michael, and he frowned. "You can't go out there, Reina," he stated, and reality hit me. I looked back at the door that Martin was now closing. They were outside on the manor grounds, and that was off limit to me. My nose tingled. But Jonathan and the others are out there, I whined. The pack is there. I'll be perfectly safe. He shook his head again, and I looked around, expecting someone to tell me this was a joke. My friends and my boyfriend were right outside, having fun, and I was trapped in here. I reached in my back pocket and pulled out my phone. I hit number 2 and held it to my ear. As soon as I heard my dad's voice, I spilled the information and pleaded my case. "They're just right outside the kitchen," I explained. I still hadn't given him any chance to even reply. "Phil is there, Marcus, Jonathan, Michael and Martin are here. Daddy, please, please don't make me stay in here. It's too humiliating." "But it's safe," came a voice that wasn't through the phone. I turned, with it still up to my ear. My dad stood there, lowering his. I clicked the button and rushed over to him. I took his hand and walked him to the smaller window. "See, Daddy? They're all right there. It's not like they're way out in the property. Michael and Martin can watch me just fine." I turned and looked up at him, my eyes wide and watering just a little. My dad watched as Elisa introduced her friends to the others. I turned and watched them all laughing together. "It's not safe, Reina," he said, but I noticed he didn't use his "and that is that" voice. I bit my lip, stood very still, and waited as he watched my friends. Finally, he looked down at me. I still didn't move. I was afraid to blink at this point. I should have known this was going to happen when Jonathan and Joel asked to have that fire. It was supposed to be for the guys while you girls had your party. I only blinked, my eyes wide. He turned slowly and looked at Michael. "Take whoever you need out there and keep her safe." I squealed and lunged, hugging him. He chuckled. No wonder I have gray hair. Michael was on his phone, and my dad pulled me back, holding onto my shoulders and looking at me. "You will do as Michael says." I nodded quickly. "You will not leave the perimeter of that fire." Again I nodded. "If Michael says he feels you need to come in, then you do." Okay, I finally said, bouncing. I was going outside. "If anything happens out there, Reina," my dad sighed, "it will be the last time." Okay, that was a little much. They were literally yards from the side of the manor. The worst that could happen is the paparazzi would get some snapshots. They were non-human media, and my dad had handled them before. 3 large men arrived, and then Michael stepped up to the door. He walked out first. I gave my dad another hug and then bounced out after him. I walked over and ignored the fact that 5 guards surrounded the exposed side of the small party. Michael and Martin were positioned closest to me. The others turned, facing outward, so they could watch the area. Allison and Missy ran over to me. "Oh, Reina, we were trying to convince the guys to go in and sneak you out. We had forgotten you couldn't come out until you didn't follow us." Jonathan walked over smiling. "But I told them to give you a few minutes, and you'd find a way, without having to sneak." I balked, and he took my hand and kissed my cheek. "I had faith in you." I chuckled and then turned. I noticed Elisa frown a bit. I guess she didn't have the same faith. Maybe that is why she agreed to come out here. The lure of the guys might not have been enough, but maybe she remembered I wasn't allowed out of the manor. I smiled and waved at her. Chapter 22. Jonathan put his arm around my waist, and we all walked over to the fire. "Where did you get that barrel?" I asked, looking at the massive metal cylinder that sat in a mound of sand with rocks around it. Joel chuckled. "We went and asked the maintenance guys. They gathered all this stuff for us." "But Joel insisted on lighting it," Jonathan chuckled, and Allison shook her head. "Joel has a thing for fire." "Hey, I'm careful," he smiled, and she kissed him. Phil and Marcus stepped away from Elisa and her friends and walked over. "So they did let you out," Phil grinned. I nodded, too happy to care. They could rib me all they wanted. I could feel the night breeze on my skin, and I loved it. I could smell the grass, the trees, and even the fire smelt wonderful. Then Jonathan's phone rang. He pulled it out and looked at me. "Did you lose it again?" I reached in my back pocket and pulled my phone out, wiggling it in front of him. He frowned and put it to his ear. "Hello?" I turned back and smiled at everyone. "This is great." Then I looked at Miles. "So, how long were you able to stay away?" I smiled. Phil laughed. "We never did. After Track, Rock, and Jackson dropped Missy off, we parked down the road and waited." "Waited?" Missy asked, looking at Miles. Miles shrugged. "Just in case." "In case what?" I asked, frowning a bit. "Really? Missy and I were very capable. We weren't made of glass." Phil looked at me. "Reina, as much as I love you, and I do, trouble does seem to have a way of finding you." He winked when I gave a little growl. Jonathan closed his phone, and I looked at him. He put his arm back around my waist. That was track. Seems his sensor showed you out of the manor. My brows wrinkled and Miles laughed. That boy is like a mother wolf with you. But I noticed Jonathan's lip only twitch in a smile. I lifted my strange locket. This? Jonathan nodded. I didn't know you guys had a signal on it. Phil cleared his throat and I looked up at him. He gave me a look that I didn't understand, and I looked back at Jonathan. He was looking elsewhere, and I wrinkled my nose. I didn't see what the problem was. If they had the signal from the tracking device in my necklace, then it would be normal for Track to freak out if it showed I was out of the manor. Paige walked over to me and smiled. So, 2 more days. I smiled back, and Jonathan turned back to us. Nicole and Margaret were all over poor Phil and Marcus. Elisa still steered clear of Phil, but Marcus wasn't so lucky. We had all sat in the chairs that were brought out, and they had pulled theirs up so that Phil was next to Margaret, then Nicole, then Marcus, and Elisa. I kept looking at the guys, waiting for a signal that I should step in, but Phil shook his head at me. Jonathan had my hand, and I finally turned to him. So, are you getting nervous? I chuckled. He nodded, and my eyes widened. He leaned over the arm of my chair. I'm terrified you'll change your mind. I rolled my eyes and didn't let him know that I had the same worry. Paige was sitting next to me, but I noticed her glance up at Michael a lot. When my cook came out with 2 helpers and platters of food, the wolves jumped up and took him from her, thanking her over and over. She smiled, and I knew she liked having so many to cook for. She only had to cook for me when I was shifted. Otherwise, it was only my wolf friends. The help had their own kitchen and cook in a different part of the manor. Do you eat? I turned to see Nicole looking at me, and I shook my head to show I didn't know what she meant. Well, being part wolf and all, she added timidly. I saw Phil move a bit out of the corner of my eye. Alpha body language. I looked at Jonathan and then back across the fire. Not when I'm on 2 legs, I smiled. Her eyes widened. You shift? She gasped, and I looked towards Elisa, certain she would have told them that. It was nearly common knowledge now anyhow, no matter how much we tried not to let it be. I nodded, trying hard to remember what Aunt Mary told me. Yes, I do, I stated calmly, then winked. I can out-eat any of these guys when I do. Miles threw his head back and laughed, and Phil grinned. She can outrun most of us, too. Nicole blinked a few times. Obviously, that wasn't the reaction she was hoping for. Miles looked at Missy. Remember the time she beat every guy in the clique? Well, except Phil? Which time? Missy chuckled. She doesn't win every time, Phil pointed out, taking another sandwich from the platter. Nearly, Missy laughed and then smiled at me. She is wicked fast, whether she's on 2 legs or 4. Oh, can we watch you all race? Elisa cried out. The only response was the crackling of the wood pieces in the fire pit. Everyone was staring at her. She looked around, shrugging. I only meant it would make for a fun game, she tried. Nicole shook her head a little, and Margaret turned to Marcus. So, can she outrun you too? She teased. Marcus shrugged. I've only ran against her once. And we tied, I put in quickly, which made everyone laugh. I looked up at the moon and smiled. It had been a long time since I stood out here and watched it. It was 3/4 full and beautiful. I used to come out here a lot and sit and look at it. That seemed such a long time ago. Phil stepped up next to me then, his shoulder touching mine. Your son, he whispered, and I nodded. Yes, the moon was like my son. I liked that thought. Do you have to shift when the moon is full? Margaret asked Marcus, trying to keep her naive voice low. but we all had excellent hearing. No, Marcus replied, without laughing at her for not knowing. That's a human myth. Oh, she whispered, and I smiled. Finally, I blinked and looked at Phil. He had been looking up as well. So how are you and the tree line girl doing? I asked. He shrugged. She went back to her pack a few weeks ago. I watched his face. And? I asked. You're a very nosy little wolf, he teased. Just watching out for my alpha. He shook his head, still smiling. Yes, that must be it. Phil looked at me and then shrugged. Female wares are hard to come by. I frowned. So, that's it? Then he winked. I asked her father if I could see her again. And? I wanted to smack him, but refrained. He said he'll think about it. Think about it, I shouted, my hackles going up. What was there to think about? Phil was an incredible alpha. Rare or not, there were only so many alpha males, too. An alpha was sought after mate, and he was one of the best. Okay, maybe I was a little prejudiced there, but he was. Down, girl, he chuckled. You know how protective we wolves are over you females. I shrugged. You should invite her to the party. As much as I'd like to, it's too soon. I saw his jaw twitch a bit and nodded. He was afraid to get his hopes up. I could send her an invitation, I tried. Phil took my hand and gave it a squeeze. I appreciate that, and I do think you two would like each other. But her pack is very protective of her. I have to do this their way. I rolled my eyes. Seriously? That's not fair. If you like each other, does she like you? He smiled and I nudged him with my arm. Well then, that's all that matters. They shouldn't put you through all of that. Jonathan had stepped up on the other side of me and he chuckled. Oh, right. I forgot about that. Well, still, it was wrong. Phil looked over me to Jonathan. How long for you? A year. Phil whistled and Jonathan nodded. Men, wolves, dads. I didn't understand it at all. Joel walked over and put some more boards in the fire. I watched it kick up the sparks and heard the crackling. Elisa walked over and looked at me. I'm sorry about the racing comment. I shrugged. It's okay. I know you were just trying to find a new game for us. She blinked, trying to decide if that was a joke at her expense. Phil's phone rang and I shook my head. You guys and your phones. Jonathan's rang too, and I turned and looked at him. He shrugged. I won't answer it. I rolled my eyes and looked to Elisa. You would think they were born with them attached, I smiled. Elisa grinned. Well, they're both very important. I'm sure it must be hard for them to have to take so much time away from their duties. Oh, so we were back to playing that game, were we? Jonathan stepped up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. What's hard is having to wait 2 more days before I can announce that we are official, he smiled at Elisa over my shoulder. She shrugged. Well, you've broken so much protocol already. With that, she turned and headed towards where her friends were surrounding Marcus. Did she really just say that? I whispered without turning. Jonathan rested his chin on my shoulder. Out of pure and uncontrollable jealousy, he smiled. Phil turned to me. The guys are on their way, he stated, and I nodded. Good. Marcus could use the help. I leaned back against Jonathan and then watched as Phil walked over to help his packmate. Miles and Missy joined him. Allison and Joel came over and we all talked about the party and random other things. Seems they were staying at a hotel in the city, which bothered me a little. You guys can stay here, I reminded them. Joel shook his head. We appreciate the offer, but you have a full house already, and besides, we're having a good time. Allison nodded. Our rooms there are incredible. Your dad didn't have to go to all that trouble. My dad, I thought, and Jonathan smiled. We put them up in a very nice hotel. It's near Beamer's, and this way, he kissed my cheek, they get to spend more time together. Allison huffed. Yeah, our families are freaks about the rules. They were only okay with this after your dad talked to them and assured them we would have separate rooms. Wow, were Jonathan and I really breaking so many rules? I frowned, but Joel grinned. I think they know that we don't always follow the rules completely, but it's that don't admit anything and they'll pretend that they don't know kind of thing. He winked and Allison giggled. That made me feel better. I knew that meant they were probably just skimming the rules like Jonathan and I, but I did feel better knowing we weren't the only ones having a hard time with them. I'm going to end there.